The series begins in the city of Alma in England, where we learn that the city has been hit by severe flooding and torrents, causing significant problems. At one location in the city, we see the police chief accompanied by 3 of his team members, Officer Joanna, Officer Deepa, and Officer Trev. The team is currently driving in a car to assist anyone who has been severely affected by the floods. However, they encounter a problem when they crash into a car in front of them that they could not see due to the overwhelming floodwaters. Joanna and Deepa decide to get out of the car and proceed on foot to search for anyone in need of help. While walking, they find a woman trapped with her child in the middle of the water and rush to rescue them. At that moment, the woman gets out of the car and heads towards Joanna and Deepa, but the strong current pulls her child away. Quickly, Joanna runs after the child to save her before the water sweeps her away. At this moment, a stranger appears, sees the situation, and decides to help. Bravely, he wades into the torrent and reaches the child, managing to save her. Suddenly, the water intensifies and almost sweeps the man away, but he quickly heads towards Joanna and hands her the child. Unfortunately, the current sweeps the man away, and no one knows what happened to him. Joanna immediately informs her colleagues, and everyone begins searching for the unfortunate man. Afterwards, Joanna and Deepa return to the police car, and we learn that Joanna is pregnant and will be giving birth soon. We also learn that Joanna will be transferring to the investigations department to become a detective, where her husband Pat also works as a detective. Meanwhile, Pat calls Joanna and scolds her for trying to wade into the water to rescue the woman and her daughter, as she knew it could endanger her life, and forgets that she is pregnant. He asks her not to do it again, and Joanna agrees. After everything that happened, Joanna and Deepa visit several residents of the city who were affected by the floods and can no longer stay in their homes. Joanna informs them that they will be moving to a school to stay there until the city is safe and they can return to their homes. She leaves Deepa with them to take them to the school while she goes to check on the homes affected by the floods to offer assistance if needed. At this moment, the police chief approaches Joanna and informs her that the Allen family has flood-resistant doors, so their home was not affected by the floods, and they will stay in their house. Joanna agrees and continues checking the houses. Eventually, Joanna goes to the Allen family home and knocks on the door. Mr. Don Allen, an elderly man, opens the door. She inquires about his condition and his wife Mary, and informs him that if he needs any help, he can contact her. After leaving the house, Joanna tries to call her husband Pat, but his phone is off, so she leaves him a voicemail asking him to inform his sister Kelly not to visit the house today due to the floods, as Joanna does not want Kelly to stay with them for a long time. Shortly after, Joanna goes to the school where all the affected residents are gathered and finds her mother, Molly, there, overseeing the assistance being provided to people. Joanna talks to her mother for a while and reassures her. She then discovers that Kelly, Pat's sister, is at the hospital with her bothersome husband Cass and their daughter Sophie, and they are taking Joanna's house key to stay there. This greatly upsets Joanna to the point where she calls her mother and decides to move in with her, but her mother tells her that she will stay at the school to help people. Joanna agrees and ends the call. The next day, somewhere in the city, it appears that the man who saved the child has regained consciousness in the street, and we learn that he is alive, thank goodness. The strange thing is that instead of seeking help, the man quickly flees the scene before the police arrive, and it seems he has committed a crime we know nothing about yet, and is trying to escape from it. On the other hand, we see that Joanna goes to work, and it is her last day as a regular officer, as she is supposed to start working as a detective with Pat the next day. Joanna goes to check on the Allen family, and, upon arriving at their home, notices unusual smoke coming from it. Quickly, she calls Deepa and breaks down the door. They enter the house to find that water has entered the house and damaged an electrical generator, causing thick smoke that led to the suffocation and death of Mr. Don Allen and his wife Mary. This situation deeply saddens Joanna, and she informs her colleagues immediately to come and take the bodies. In the meantime, Joanna is called to another house after the owner discovers a body inside. Upon arriving at the house, she is greeted by the owner, who tells her that when he opened the elevator, he found the body of a stranger he had never seen before. Joanna goes to the elevator and examines the dead young man's body, noting in her report that water had entered the elevator while the young man was inside, causing him to drown. After finishing her work for the day, Joanna heads to the hospital to check on her unborn child. During this time, Joanna's mother arrives at the hospital, crying, thinking that something bad had happened to Joanna. But Joanna reassures her that she is fine. During their conversation, we learn that Joanna's father, who was a police officer, passed away a long time ago in the same hospital, which explains her mother's concern upon hearing that Joanna was there. Afterward, everyone leaves the hospital, and the next day, Joanna goes to work to find everyone in a state of tension. Joanna asks about the reason and is informed by the medical examiner that the young man found dead in the elevator did not die from drowning during the floods, but was killed 3 days earlier by a strong blow to the head. This means that a murder took place and someone took advantage of the floods to make it appear that the young man had drowned. Joanna is shocked by this revelation and goes to Pat to ask if she can take on the investigation, but he refuses, saying that Joanna is still new to the investigations department and cannot handle such a complex case. Joanna reluctantly agrees with him, feeling frustrated, but she decides to gather information about the case and follow it behind the scenes. Joanna approaches her colleague Babak at work and tries to get as much information as possible about the case from him. Suddenly, Joanna feels dizzy and faints. She's taken to the hospital where Pat and her mother, Molly, are with her. The doctor reassures everyone that Joanna is fine and that fainting is normal in the last 3 months of pregnancy, and Joanna is now in her 7th month. Pat is shocked to learn that Joanna is in her 7th month, as he thought she was in her 6th month. Joanna confesses to Pat that she had to lie to him because if he had known she was in her 7th month, he wouldn't have allowed her to transfer to the investigations department until after she had given birth. Pat feels upset about this and leaves. The next day, Joanna goes to work as usual, but she discovers that Pat told her colleagues she had taken maternity leave, which upsets her. However, she decides not to let it bother her and continues her conversation with Babak, asking about the progress of the case. After a while, Babak leaves to talk to Pat, and Joanna seizes the opportunity to sit at Babak's computer and take all the information related to the unidentified young man who was found dead in the elevator so that she can work on the case herself. Later, Joanna returns home and sits with her mother, telling her that she has an idea to identify the unidentified young man, and thus may be able to find out who killed him. Joanna's idea is to use a website to input the young man's DNA and try to identify any relatives through the site. Joanna is afraid to do this because it is prohibited, but her mother, Molly, encourages her to go ahead since no one will know. Joanna agrees and inputs the DNA into the site, hoping for results. The next day, Joanna and her mother go to the school, and during this time, Molly goes to talk to a woman called the counselor, who is the city's mayor. Molly tells her that she intends to run against her in the upcoming election, which upsets the counselor, but it is unclear how she will react. Shortly after, Joanna receives a message from the website, indicating that the DNA she entered matches with a girl named Tasha, who is the sister of the unidentified young man. Minutes later, Tasha calls Joanna because Joanna had entered her phone number on the site. Molly advises her daughter not to answer, but Joanna decides to take Tasha's call. Tasha tells her that the website informed her that there was a DNA match between her and someone else, and she asks Joanna who this person is. Joanna tells her that this person is her brother, who died a few days ago. Tasha is shocked and tells Joanna that her brother died 5 years ago, and wonders how he could return and die again. Before Joanna can respond, Pat arrives, so Joanna ends the call to prevent Pat from finding out anything, as using the site is prohibited for police officers. Pat then talks to Joanna and reconciles with her over what happened the previous day. During their conversation, Joanna receives another call from Tasha, and Pat asks who the caller is, but Joanna lies to him, saying it's just a friend, and she doesn't answer the call. After finishing her conversation with Pat, Joanna leaves the school and listens to a voicemail from Tasha, who tells her that she wants to know the truth about what happened to her brother. Joanna begins to realize that the coming days will be very difficult. Later, Joanna returns to her mother's house and starts searching for Tasha's Facebook account. She finds pictures of Tasha with the unidentified young man and realizes that his name is Daniel and that he is indeed Tasha's brother, but it remains a mystery how he died in the past and returned to die again. The next day, Joanna goes to work and meets with Police Chief Mackey, who tells her that her transfer to the investigation department will be delayed a bit until they deal with the numerous problems caused by the floods. Mikey also informs Joanna that they have identified around 30 potential names, one of whom could be the unidentified young man. Joanna takes these names and begins to review them. Then, Joanna goes to the person who owned the house where Daniel died. There is an unknown young man, and Joanna discovers at that moment that this person is not the owner of the house or the building in general, but rather just its manager. The real owner of the building is a wealthy person from the city named Jack. Joanna asks the manager to give her a tour of the building where Daniel died so she can study it. The manager takes her to the building, and they spend time walking around. The problem is that there is a room in the building that is locked, and the manager does not have a key. Joanna is surprised but says nothing and continues walking. At the same time, Molly, Joanna's mother, starts collecting signatures from people so she can participate in the elections. When she finishes, she meets Jack, who we know is the owner of the building where Daniel died. Jack tells Molly that he wants to donate to the flood relief fund she is heading. Jack is accompanied by Kelly, Pat's sister, who works with Jack, and Kelly takes a photo of Molly and Jack to promote Jack. After that, Joanna and Pat return to their home, where they talk with Kelly and her daughters a bit. While they are talking, they hear a knock on the door. Joanna goes to open it and is surprised to find Tasha, whom she quickly takes away before anyone can see her. They sit in Joanna's car, and Joanna explains everything to Tasha about her brother and that his body was entered into the DNA database, which led Tasha to Joanna. Joanna tells Tasha that what she did was illegal and asks her not to tell anyone. Tasha agrees and only asks Joanna to take her to the police station. Joanna does so, and Tasha meets with Babbitt and Jack. Tasha tells them that she is Daniel's sister, the person who died without knowing his identity, and asks to see her brother's body. Mikey and Babbitt initially refuse, asking for a DNA test first to confirm that she is the sibling of the deceased person, and then they will show her the body. Tasha agrees and leaves. Meanwhile, Joanna is sitting in her car and is surprised to see the stranger who saved the child initially. She quickly goes to him and is very happy that he is still alive, and she asks him what happened to him. He tells her that the river was far from the shore until he reached it, and fortunately, he emerged safely. The stranger introduces himself as Lee and explains that he did not go to the police to tell them he was still alive, as it would cause him a lot of trouble. Joanna agrees to this and promises not to tell anyone about his survival. She also informs him that Amy, the child's mother whom he saved, wants to thank him. Lee agrees and goes with Joanna to Amy, who sincerely thanks him for saving her daughter. Afterward, Joanna receives a call from Mackey, the police chief, who tells her that Finn, the grandson of the Allen family, wants to meet with her. Joanna agrees and plans to meet him the next day. We see Mackey returning home, where we discover that his wife is the counselor and that they have 2 adopted children. We return to Joanna, who goes to her mother's house and is surprised to find Tasha there. Tasha tells Joanna that she went to the police station, but did not reveal that she entered the DNA into the database to avoid causing harm. Tasha asks Joanna to show her a photo of her brother's body to confirm that the deceased person is indeed Daniel, her brother. Joanna agrees, despite this being illegal, and shows Tasha a photo of Daniel from the crime scene. When Tasha sees the photo, she confirms 100% that it is her brother, which angers her and raises questions about why her brother died 5 years ago when he was not actually dead at that time. Meanwhile, Pat is about to arrive home, so Joanna asks Tasha to leave, and they decide to meet the next day. The next day, Joanna and Deepa go to meet Finn, the grandson of the Allen family, who is very sad about his grandparents. Finn expresses his feeling that what happened was a crime, not just an accident, as their house was fortified against floods, and he wonders how the flood got into the house. Joanna thinks and realizes that her mother, Molly, is the head of the flood relief fund, and asks Finn to talk to Molly to see if they can obtain any information. Finn agrees and thanks Joanna. After that, Joanna meets Tasha at the hotel where she is staying, and Tasha tells Joanna that her brother Daniel, after faking his death 5 years ago, lived under a different identity. Tasha wants to know this identity. Joanna thinks about it and eventually contacts Deepa, asking him to send a list of the names that the police had suspected. Deepa agrees, although it is also illegal, and sends the names to Joanna. Tasha and Joanna compare the names and discover that the name Alex is likely the false identity of her brother Daniel. Tasha is sure of this because Alex lived in a place that Daniel loved very much before he traveled to France with his sister, Tasha, who lives in France. Joanna and Tasha are convinced that Alex is Daniel, and they go to the building where Alex lived to explore his apartment, hoping to find clues about the killer. While in the building, they meet Lee, whom Tasha recognizes and hugs. This causes Joanna confusion and a lack of understanding about the relationship between Tasha and Lee. After some thought, Joanna starts to suspect Lee, especially since he was unwilling to meet the police and might be the killer trying to hide. Later, everyone goes to the building where Daniel lived. Lee talks with Tasha and Joanna, discovering that Daniel had been living in the city for a long time and working there. At some point, Lee met Daniel and learned that he had changed his name because he had old crimes he didn't want anyone to know about. Therefore, he changed his name and settled in the city with Lee, and they worked together. Lee explains that when Daniel disappeared a few days ago, he started searching for him and asked Tasha why she was there. Tasha tells Lee that she thought Daniel had been dead for a long time, but now she confirms that he has indeed died. When Lee learns that Daniel has died, he is shocked, and it seems he was only coming to find him. Meanwhile, Joanna receives a call from Mackie, the police chief, who tells her that Roy, the lead investigator, wants to see her immediately. Mackie also informs her that Roy suspects a person named Alex might be the owner of the body they found, so Roy asks Pat to go to Alex's house or office to check it out. Joanna is very worried that Pat will discover she's investigating the case, so she tells Tasha and Lee to leave and then also leaves the place. Later, Pat and another officer arrive at Alex's office and search it. Then they go downstairs and ask the building security if they saw anyone enter Daniel's house or office. The security tells them that a pregnant woman with a girl named Tasha and a strange person entered the office or house. At this moment, Pat is shocked when he realizes that the pregnant woman is Joanna, his wife, and that she is investigating the case behind his back. We return to Joanna, who receives a voicemail from Chris, Jack's building manager, telling her he wants her to come immediately because he managed to open the room that they couldn't open in the building. Joanna is pleased and decides to go see him. Later, Joanna goes to her work, and Roy, the lead investigator, tells her that he has decided to assign her to Daniel's case, even though she hasn't completed her training yet. Joanna thanks Roy and begins working with the investigators. After a while, Joanna shows Roy a picture of Tasha with her brother Daniel and tells him that Daniel looks exactly like the deceased person, which raises Roy's concern, and he asks Babak to expedite the DNA analysis for Tasha. Joanna talks with Roy and discovers that on the day Daniel died, when she found his body in the elevator, there was a red car in the building's garage, which then completely disappeared from the crime scene. Roy is surprised by this information and asks Joanna to investigate if the car might lead them to any clues. Joanna agrees and leaves. Joanna and her friend Deepa go to Jack's building to meet Chris and see the room he managed to open, but they don't find Chris. Instead, they find a security guard who takes them to the previously locked room. Strangely, the room is completely empty, which surprises Joanna and makes her suspect that something was in the room that Jack might have hidden. Afterwards, Joanna and Deepa return home, where Joanna searches for Lee because she has strong suspicions about him. She spends time looking for him, and her suspicions grow. At the same time, Joanna goes home and finds Kelly cleaning the house in preparation for a baby shower. Joanna is pleased that Kelly is taking care of her and asks Kelly if she knows anything about Chris, who worked with Jack. Kelly tells her that Chris had some issues with Jack, but when Kelly went to look for him, she couldn't find him. Joanna goes to Kelly's office and opens her computer to find out Chris's address. After a while, Joanna arrives at Kelly's friend's house, where she finds one of them pregnant and discovers that Kelly had organized the party for her friend, not for herself. Joanna argues with Kelly, and Pat arrives, talking to Joanna and feeling frustrated that she is investigating Daniel's case behind his back. Pat speaks harshly, telling her she is not a real investigator for doing such activities, which makes Joanna angry, and she leaves the place. Later, Tasha goes with Lee to his house, where they sit and reminisce about old times. After a while, someone comes to Lee, so he leaves Tasha and goes to talk to the person. This person is Jack, who has a confrontation with Lee. Tasha observes this tension, but does not know the reason for the argument. Later, Joanna calls Tasha to meet her, and Tasha agrees, so Joanna goes to meet her. However, she is surprised to find Babak and another officer taking Tasha away. Joanna hides so they don't see her and waits for Tasha in a bar where Lee is also present. Lee talks to Joanna, and she asks him why Daniel changed his name to Alex and why he does not want to go to the police to testify. Lee explains that Daniel changed his name to escape from his old crimes, and he does not want to go to the police for 2 reasons. First, because he has a criminal past himself and fears the police might suspect him. And second, because Daniel and Lee had earned about $100,000 from their work together, and before Daniel's death, this money disappeared. Lee suspects that Daniel took the money and fears that the police will find out and accuse him of killing Daniel. Joanna understands his explanation and waits for Tasha. After a short while, we see Tasha in the morgue. Meanwhile, the officers have confirmed through the analysis that the body indeed belongs to Daniel's sister, and they have now brought her in to identify the body as her brother's. Tasha recognizes the body and realizes it is her brother's. She leaves the place devastated and now heads to Joanna and Lee. Tasha is still in shock and unable to sit, so Lee takes her to calm her down. As for Joanna, she decides to go to Chris at the address she has. When Joanna arrives at Chris's house, she is shocked to find that Chris has hanged himself and is dead. We will find out later what Joanna will do, but for now, we move to Molly, who was at her farm planting. Mackie and his son come to the farm to plant as well, since Mackie's son loves planting very much. During this time, Finn, the family's grandson, comes to talk to Molly and informs her that Jack had a new housing project in the city. Jack was supposed to build drainage channels and simple dams in flood-prone areas, but he cut corners and did not build anything. As a result, the flood destroyed the city. Finn asks Molly to come with him on a tour, and she agrees. Finn takes her to Jack's housing project and shows her the areas where Jack was supposed to build drainage channels, but nothing was done. After that, Molly returns home and finds Sarah, the consultant who is with Mackie. She discovers that Sarah is now with Jack. Molly sees Sarah at Jack's house and quietly withdraws, discovering that they are having an affair. Now we return to Joanna, who is still at Chris's house. She has called Mackie and the officer with him to see what they can do about Chris's case. Mackie asks Joanna why she is there, and Joanna gets nervous because she cannot say she was working on Daniel's case. So, she tells Mackie that she came to take something from Chris related to Kelly and Jack's work, which Chris was dismissed over. Mackie believes her and lets the situation pass. After that, Joanna returns home and talks with Pat, telling him everything she has done since contacting Tasha, up to discovering that Chris was dead. Pat warns her that she is getting herself into trouble and takes her phone to delete Chris's message to her to avoid any evidence against her. He tells her that she needs to talk to Kelly and explain the situation so that if anyone asks, she can say that Joanna went to Chris on Kelly's request. Joanna agrees, even though she does not understand why Pat is so worried. The next day, Joanna goes to work, where Roy is in a meeting with the investigators. He informs them that he suspects Tasha is involved in her brother Daniel's death and that she should be investigated, Joanna rejects this idea, which upsets Roy as he feels she has ignored his concerns. Joanna apologizes and Roy leaves. Pat is annoyed with Joanna because her actions are harming both his and her work. After that, Joanna goes to Kelly and Keith's house, which has been destroyed by the floods, and talks to Kelly. Kelly tells Joanna that she came to get her belongings from the house and will stay at Jack's house until her own house is repaired. Kelly apologizes to Joanna for inconveniencing her, but Joanna assures her that it's fine. Joanna asks Kelly to cover up the Chris issue, and Kelly agrees. Joanna then discusses Chris with Kelly and learns that the real reason Jack dismissed Chris was because he had opened a room in Jack's building that should not have been opened. Joanna wonders if Jack is hiding something disastrous in that room and suspects that Jack might have killed Chris rather than it being a suicide. Based on all this, Joanna goes to Chris's house, which was being guarded by Deepa, and asks Deepa to show her the surveillance camera footage around Chris's house. Deepa shows Joanna the footage, and Joanna discovers that a stranger was heading toward Chris's house shortly before Chris's death, but the person's identity cannot be determined from the footage. Joanna becomes more convinced that Chris was murdered, not that it was a suicide, and suspects that Jack is responsible. On the other hand, we see Tasha sitting with Lee and telling him that she saw him and Jack arguing. Tasha asks who Jack is and what his connection is to her brother Daniel's death, as she is very uneasy about him. Lee tells her that Jack has nothing to do with it and leaves. Later, Tasha is about to sleep, specifically on the same bed her brother used to sleep on. While sleeping, she feels something in the pillow, so she sits up and finds a box. Inside the box, she finds a key to a store in a residential complex owned by Jack. This makes her more suspicious of Jack, so she decides to go to Jack's house at the housing project. She tells him that she is Daniel's sister and asks if he has anything to do with her brother's death. He tells her that he knows her brother well and says he has no interest in killing him, as Daniel's death would disrupt Jack's work. Tasha also realizes that the land in front of the housing project belonged to Daniel and another person named William Kane, and knows that William's ownership of the land disrupted Jack's work. She asks Jack if he knows who William is, but Tasha does not know who William is, and Jack decides that further discussion with her would not be useful, so he leaves, and Tasha departs, angry. As she is leaving, Pat comes and takes her for questioning. Now, Roy and Pat are sitting with her, and Roy discovers that he suspects she is lying, and that she knew her brother Daniel was alive, contrary to her claims. The evidence is that Roy found out Daniel was in France weeks before he died, and was very close to Tasha. So, how did she not know he was there and never met him? Tasha tells him she didn't know her brother was in France and is now shocked that he was there and didn't come to see her. She is so upset that she leaves the place, angry. Although this is not legal and she should have continued the investigation, she leaves. On her way out, she encounters Joanna and tells her what happened, revealing that she found out her brother was in France weeks before his death and hadn't checked on her. Tasha then leaves the place, still angry. Later, Pat meets Joanna and asks her about what Tasha said. Pat tells Joanna that Roy expressed doubts about Tasha in the morning meeting, which has caused major issues in their work. Pat asks Joanna that if she wants to maintain their marriage and their lives, she needs to manage their work better. After that, Pat leaves Joanna and goes. Joanna then goes to meet her mother, Molly, and Finn. Finn and Molly discover that Jack has been building houses in the city in violation of regulations, such as not installing drainage systems to reduce flood severity, and he faces no penalties because Sarah, who is on the city council, approves any project by Jack without question. This is, of course, because Sarah and Jack have an illicit relationship. Finn also informs them that Jack is currently building a new residential project and has decided again not to install drainage systems that mitigate flooding. Instead, he is building small drains on the land in front of his new project, connecting them to the project. If the government comes and inspects, nothing will happen to him. Instead, the problem will fall on the landowners who built the small, non-compliant drains. The surprise is that these landowners are Daniel, the unidentified person, and William Kane. Joanna and her mother are shocked by this, and Molly decides they need to expose Jack and Sarah for everything they are doing. On the other hand, Tasha goes to the storage unit where she found the key in Daniel's pillow and opens it. She finds a lot of documents and contracts between Daniel and another person named William Kane. She also finds documents proving they own certain containers in a specific location in the city, along with large amounts of money that Daniel seems to have obtained from Lee. Tasha contacts Joanna and tells her all this, prompting Joanna to go see the containers. Joanna goes to the location of the containers and finds containers, construction equipment, and other items. Lee shows up with a weapon, but when he sees that Joanna is alone, he puts the weapon aside. At that moment, Joanna talks to Lee and asks him to explain what this place is and what the containers and equipment are for. Lee decides to confess everything to Joanna. He tells her that he and Daniel met here in the city by chance and decided to work with Jack, who unfortunately asked them to engage in illegal activities. These illegal activities involved purchasing land in front of Jack's new residential project, so Jack could build non-compliant drainage pipes and manipulate the law. Lee tells her that they indeed bought the land and that Jack intended to sell the residential project and give them money for the land they purchased, along with additional profits. He also tells her that Jack suddenly became bankrupt and was unable to continue the project, so he needed a large amount of liquidity. He came up with a devilish plan and asked Daniel and Lee to steal the equipment to claim the insurance money and continue with the project, while they would sell the equipment illegally abroad to get the money. However, the plan failed because Daniel was killed, and Lee could not sell the equipment. Jack was unable to claim the insurance money because he wanted to get it only after the stolen equipment was completely out of the country to avoid revealing his dirty plan. Additionally, William Kane disappeared, which disrupted Jack's work on the land where he intended to build the drainage pipes. Lee tells Joanna that he managed to find a buyer for the equipment and will sell it tomorrow to recover the money Daniel stole or hid before his death. He asks her not to report him and to let him complete his task. However, Joanna is not concerned about this and focuses only on the idea that Jack is a criminal and might be the one who killed Chris because he knew something about the dirty work in the locked room, whether it contained papers or evidence against him. Joanna now knows that Jack will kill anyone who stands in his way and doesn't know how to stop him. Evidence of this is that she sees Molly heading to a city council meeting regarding the new project Jack is building. Before entering the meeting, she hears Sarah and Jack talking. Jack knows Sarah must approve his project so that investors will be convinced and return to pay money, as Jack is now completely bankrupt. Jack also mentions that the police have investigated him about Chris, so he had to tell them he was with Sarah to avoid being accused of killing Chris. This enrages Sarah because this information will reach Mackie, confirming her fears of being cheated on. After all this, a city council meeting is held, attended by Sarah, Jack, and council members, including Molly. The meeting is also broadcast on television. Sarah approves Jack's new project without any modifications regarding sewage channels or any violations of laws and specifications. This causes Molly to lose her temper and publicly expose Sarah and Jack, accusing them of working together due to their illicit relationship. Since Sarah approves everything Jack asks for due to their illegal relationship, the police come and take Molly away. Molly leaves the venue on her bicycle to return home, as evidenced by a car hitting Molly, and we don't know if she has died or not. On the other hand, Lee drops Joanna off at her home and asks her not to report the equipment he has until he can sell it. Joanna does not give him a clear answer and leaves. At that moment, Keith sees Joanna getting out of Lee's car and becomes angry. Joanna goes to Pat, who tells her he will go to Keith and Keeley to help them with the house Jack gave them. Joanna agrees, and Pat leaves. Later, Joanna receives a call from Tasha, who tells her that she found a document with William Kane's address in Daniel's storage. Joanna feels happy, and they decide to go there together. Joanna then receives a call from Deepa, who informs her that her mother Molly had an accident and is now in the hospital. Joanna rushes to the hospital to check on her mother. Meanwhile, Pat goes to Keith's house and speaks with him privately. Pat receives a call from Joanna informing him about what happened to her mother Molly, so he goes to the hospital to check on Molly's condition. Afterwards, Pat and Joanna talk, and Joanna tells Pat that she suspects Jack is responsible for what happened to her mother. Pat promises to investigate and leaves. The next day, Pat goes to the scene of the accident involving Molly and investigates the crime scene, while Joanna takes her mother Molly home after her discharge from the hospital. Joanna leaves Molly at home and goes to get some drinks. Meanwhile, Joanna calls Pat and asks if he has inspected the crime scene. Pat replies that he has and found traces of a car on Molly's bicycle and plans to check Jack's car to see if it was the one that hit her. Joanna notices that Jack is going to her mother's house to check on her, so she follows him and overhears them. She discovers that her mother and Jack had a past romantic relationship even before Joanna's father's death, which is the main reason Molly was upset with Jack when she learned of his relationship with Sarah and decided to expose him as she did with the project. Joanna confronts them, telling them that she heard everything and that they are corrupt, and then leaves. At that moment, Jack follows her and asks her to come with him to his car. Joanna notices that he is not in his car but in a taxi, which confirms her suspicion that Jack was the one who hit her mother because his car is missing. Joanna gets into the taxi with Jack, who takes her to the police station and then leaves. Later, Jack goes to his project, where Sarah arrives and tells him that she won the election but admits she cannot provide the money needed to complete the project, or even the sand Jack needs to build the barriers to prevent floods and exposure. Jack is disappointed that Sarah cannot meet his demands and leaves her. He then calls Kelly and asks her to sell his car because he needs the money, and Kelly agrees. Meanwhile, Joanna takes Tasha and they go to William Kane's house, which Tasha managed to find the address of. They discover that the house is inhabited by a blind woman named Emma and her child Billy. Joanna and Tasha talk to Emma and uncover crucial information. First, Emma is Daniel's wife, and Billy is their son. Emma tells them that she planned to escape with her husband Daniel and their son Billy from the city to start a new life, which is why Daniel took the money from Lee. However, Daniel had been missing for a long time, and she was surprised to learn of Daniel's death and that they cannot escape now. Emma asks them if Lee was the one who killed Daniel. They are surprised by this and ask her why she suspects Lee. Emma tells them that Lee was so corrupt that he suggested to Daniel to change his identity after faking his death so that his family would not recognize him. Daniel always said that if he took the money from Lee, Lee would kill him, even though he had left Lee the equipment he stole from Jack to sell and make money. Tasha is shocked by this information, especially since she thought Lee was like a brother to her. Finally, Joanna asks Emma about William Kane and discovers that he is her son Billy and that the name William Kane was used by his father in official documents to invalidate them. Joanna decides to leave to avoid drawing attention at work. During the events, Joanna was calling Pat and asking him about the condition of Jack's car. Pat informed her that he had inspected the car and found it to be in good condition, and that Jack was not involved in the incident that happened to her mother. At this time, Joanna informed Pat that she had learned everything about Emma and her son's case, and that Tasha was currently with them. Pat ended the call and went to see Mackie, raising suspicions that Mackie and Pat might be working together. Pat explained the issues to Mackie, but Mackie told him that he would handle it and keep his wife away from the Daniel case. Meanwhile, Kelly was at her home when suddenly the police arrived to arrest her husband, Keith. Kelly, who was in a state of shock due to not understanding why her husband was being arrested, quickly called Pat and Joanna, who went to her immediately. Pat left Joanna and went to speak with his sister Kelly, while a call came in for Tasha, informing her that the police were coming to arrest her. Tasha asked Joanna if she was the one who reported her, and Joanna confirmed that she had not reported anything. Joanna began to calmly think about the situation and discovered that Pat was the only person who knew about Tasha's case. Joanna also discovered, by examining Pat's phone, that he had been working with Jack in some capacity and that he had been monitoring the smuggling of containers containing equipment. She realized that Keith was involved in the operation due to his work at the port, and thus his arrest was related to these illegal activities. Joanna also discovered that Pat had been trying to stop her from pursuing the case because it would implicate him. Pat came to take his phone from Joanna and went to follow up on the equipment smuggling issue. Meanwhile, Tasha was in the police station, where Roy accused her of killing her brother, but Tasha denied this and said that the person involved was Lee, who was smuggling the stolen equipment. Roy and the officers went to arrest Lee, who was preparing to smuggle the equipment, but when they arrived, Lee managed to escape quickly. In the meantime, Deepa, one of the officers, discovered a car hidden in a field. The car was the red one that Joanna had suspected was related to Daniel's murder, which had disappeared from the crime scene. Joanna went to Pat and informed him that she had discovered he had been working with Lee and Keith in smuggling equipment, and that he knew Daniel and was involved in his death in some way. Pat, who was feeling guilty, decided to reveal everything to Joanna. Pat told Joanna that Mackey had been a corrupt officer and that he had worked with him in the past. Pat recounted to Joanna the details of the incident that led to Daniel's death, revealing that Mackey was the one who killed Daniel after Daniel tried to take the money for himself and refused to give anything to Jack. In the end, it turns out that Mackey was the real killer of Daniel and that he had been collaborating with Jack in illegal activities. Joanna realized that Pat had been trying to protect himself from being exposed for his involvement in the illegal cases, and she began to understand more about the complex events that led to Daniel's death. And here, the memories end, and we understand everything that happened. We return to Pat, who was standing with Joanna after telling her everything. Joanna was extremely shocked and could never have imagined that Mackey, her leader, and Pat, her husband, were involved in such corruption. So, she cursed Pat and left him. At the same time, Mackey was at the police station, dealing with the officers to protect the townspeople because the floods were about to return. At that moment, a corrupt officer arrives and informs Mackey that Lee had learned that the police were coming to arrest him, but he had taken a weapon and fled. Mackey contacts Lee and apologizes for not being able to stop the officers before they arrived. Lee knows that Mackey told him he could go to Emma's house where he might find the money Daniel stole. Lee agrees and goes to Emma's house, but he doesn't find the money because it has disappeared. Lee contacts Mackey and learns that there is no money with Emma. Mackey asks him to come meet him without wasting any time, and indeed, Lee goes to meet Mackey. Mackey advises Lee to flee the city even without money because Joanna knows everything and could have him imprisoned at any moment. At this point, Lee becomes furious and decides to take out his anger on Joanna. Meanwhile, Mackey decides to take revenge on Jack because he was cheating on him with his wife, and he beats him up. Later, a message arrives for Joanna from Amy, her friend who she and Lee saved at the very beginning. Amy asks Joanna to come now to take her to school so she can be safe. Immediately, Joanna goes to Amy's house and discovers that Lee had taken Amy and her daughter to school to protect them. Lee had stolen Amy's phone to be able to send a message to Joanna. Lee tells Joanna that he will kill her because she is the reason the stolen equipment sale was stopped, and also because he was arrested. At that moment, Joanna realizes that she is not the reason for his arrest. Rather, it was Tasha who reported Lee because she thought he had killed her brother, Daniel. Lee is shocked and decides to find Tasha to tell her that he did not kill her brother. Meanwhile, Joanna asks Lee to confess to everything he did, asking him if he was the one who moved Daniel's body to the elevator so that people would think he died in the floods. Lee doesn't respond to Joanna's questions and continues driving the car recklessly until it flips over. Lee is seriously injured and feels like he is about to die. Lee confesses everything to Joanna, saying that he was the one who moved Daniel's body to the elevator and that he used the red car for that task, which is why the car disappeared from the crime scene. He also tells her that he and Mackey went to Chris to threaten him not to tell Joanna about the blood in the closed room, but Chris had been drinking and told them that he was an honest man. So they decided to kill him and hanged him to make it look like a suicide. After Joanna learned everything, she started feeling very exhausted because she was about to give birth. Lee gets out of the car to find help. At this time, Tasha was with Pat at the police station, and Tasha receives a message from Lee informing her that Joanna was in an accident and is now giving birth. Tasha and Pat rush to the scene and discover that Joanna has given birth. Joanna delivered the baby herself at that moment. While Lee dies from his injuries, Tasha feels deep sorrow despite everything he had done. They go to the hospital and Molly comes to check on Joanna and apologizes to her for everything she did with Jack, promising never to do it again. Joanna comes out and begins to talk with Pat about how to deal with the problems she discovered about Pat. During their conversation, they arrive at Mackie's place, who came to congratulate Joanna on the new baby, and at the same time threatens her, saying that if she confesses to anything, it could ruin her reputation and get her imprisoned. After that, Mackie leaves. At that moment, Pat tells Joanna that he will support her in any decision she makes, even if it leads to his imprisonment. Joanna and Pat go to the police station, where Joanna decides to file a report with Roy and reveal everything that happened to get justice for Daniel and to bring the corrupt Mackie to justice. Although Pat knows that things will be tough, he doesn't care because Mackie truly deserves it. And so the series ends after everyone gets what they deserve.